October 25, 1944. In the pitch-black waters of the Surigao Strait, a massive Japanese fleet, including 2 battleships, steamed north, straight into a trap. They believed the Americans were asleep, blind in the darkness. But 7 miles away on the bridge of the USS West Virginia, Admiral Jesse Oldendorf was already watching, not with his eyes, but with invisible waves pulsing through the night. Radar. A technology so new the Japanese had no defense against it. On glowing green screens, American sailors tracked the enemy fleet like ghosts on the water. At 3:45 in the morning, before the Japanese even saw a single American ship, Oldendorf's gunners had their firing solutions. When the order came, 16-inch shells thundered through the dark, guided not by sight, but by echoes. To the Japanese sailors, it was witchcraft. An enemy they could not see was tearing their fleet apart. It wasn't witchcraft. It was the night the United States Navy learned to see in the dark. By the autumn of 1944, the Pacific War had reached its turning point. Japan's empire was collapsing from every direction. The Americans had captured Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the islands from which bombers could now reach Tokyo itself. The Imperial Navy, once the master of the Pacific, was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting for relevance. In October, the United States launched the largest amphibious operation in its history, the invasion of Leyte in the central Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur had returned to fulfill his promise. "I shall return." Behind him came Admiral William Bull Halsey and Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, commanding 2 vast fleets that stretched across hundreds of miles of ocean. The goal was simple and final: cut Japan off from its last oil supply in the Dutch East Indies. For Japan's high command, the prospect was catastrophic. Without oil, the Navy could not move, the Air Force could not fly, and the factories would die in silence. The Imperial Navy had only one answer left: a final, desperate gamble called Operation Shogo. The plan was elegant on paper and suicidal in practice. The Japanese would divide what remained of their fleet into 4 forces and attack Leyte Gulf from multiple directions. Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force would strike from the north through the Sibuyan Sea. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura and Rear Admiral Kiyohide Shima would attack from the south through the narrow passage known as Surigao Strait. To lure the main American carriers away, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, the same man who had lost the Marianas battle months earlier, would bring a decoy carrier fleet down from the north. If all went perfectly, the American invasion fleet off Leyte would be trapped from 3 sides and annihilated. But perfection in 1944 was no longer a Japanese luxury. Fuel was short, communications were unreliable, and most of all, the Americans had something Japan did not understand: the ability to see at night. Radar had matured in the Pacific faster than anyone imagined. Every major U.S. battleship now carried the Mark 8 fire control radar, capable of tracking a target beyond visual range and calculating a gun solution in seconds. On the surface, that meant darkness no longer mattered. The ocean's oldest rule, that night favored the attacker, was suddenly reversed. The new rule was simpler: whoever could see first, killed first. Surigao Strait, a narrow ribbon of water only 30 miles long and 10 wide, was the perfect setting for radar warfare. Its geography was a funnel. Anyone entering from the south could only advance in a straight line. Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, commanding the 7th Fleet's bombardment force, understood that better than anyone. He arranged his ships in what naval tacticians called a crossing the T. His battleships formed a line perpendicular to the strait's mouth, their guns aimed down its throat. The Japanese would have to sail directly into that gunfire, a formation nightmare once studied in textbooks, now about to unfold in the dark. Oldendorf had 6 battleships: West Virginia, Maryland, Mississippi, Tennessee, California, and Pennsylvania. Some were resurrected veterans of Pearl Harbor, their hulls rebuilt and their guns fitted with radar systems that had never yet been tested in real battle. They would soon prove their worth in a way the world had never seen. At dusk on October 24th, Oldendorf's picket destroyers and PT boats began patrolling the southern entrance of the strait. They would be the eyes and ears of the ambush. Their radar screens pulsed with echoes, sometimes friendly, sometimes phantom. Every movement was logged and relayed. The night was moonless, humid, and heavy with silence. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Japanese southern force was closing in. No one on the American side needed to see them. The machines already could. By midnight on October 24th, the southern horizon of the Philippine Sea glowed faintly with lightning. Rain squalls drifted across the Surigao Strait like curtains. Beyond them came the Japanese southern force under Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura. Two battleships, Yamashiro and Fuso, escorted by a heavy cruiser and 4 destroyers. Their mission was impossible from the start. They were to force their way through the strait, smash the American invasion fleet at Leyte, and die if necessary in the attempt. Nishimura's ships were already bleeding fuel. Their radar sets were primitive, often disabled by the storm. The crewmen stood on open decks scanning darkness with binoculars that showed nothing but rain. They believed the Americans would be surprised, asleep, unprepared for a night assault. No one told them that the Americans had been tracking their every move for hours. At 10 minutes past midnight, a line of American PT boats guarding the southern entrance picked up faint echoes on their radar scopes. Small blips at first, indistinct, flickering, then steady. The enemy was entering the funnel. The torpedo boats darted forward, attacking through the dark with no visual contact, guided only by radar bearings and compass headings. Their torpedoes missed, but their radios did not. Each boat transmitted contact reports to Oldendorf's flagship, the USS Louisville. Within minutes, the entire American fleet knew exactly where the Japanese were and how fast they were coming. By 1 o'clock in the morning, destroyers along the western edge of the strait began to form their attack lines. Lieutenant Commander Robert Cowan aboard the USS Melvin later recalled that the radar picture looked like a parade route. Every ship in the Japanese column could be seen, plotted, and labeled. There was no need for flares or spotlights. The enemy was outlined in electricity. Oldendorf studied the plotting board inside his Combat Information Center. The radar operators called out range and bearing in clipped voices. Target Group A, 20 miles closing. Group B, smaller returns, possible destroyers. The admiral nodded. He would let the destroyers strike first. The main guns would wait until the Japanese were caught in the narrowest part of the channel. At 2 in the morning, the first American destroyer squadrons raced ahead. They fired spreads of torpedoes guided by radar coordinates, unheard of only a year before. The results were instantaneous and terrifying. One salvo struck Fuso amidships, breaking the old battleship in half. Her 2 sections burned independently in the darkness, drifting apart like floating furnaces. Minutes later, another torpedo struck Yamashiro, slowing her advance but not stopping it. Nishimura, unaware of the full scale of the trap, ordered the rest of his ships to continue forward. He believed he was fighting a handful of American cruisers. In truth, he was sailing into a wall of 6 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 28 destroyers, all with radar sighted and guns trained. On American bridges, officers watched their radar screens rather than the horizon. The glowing traces told them everything they needed to know: target bearing, range, speed, and heading. To the younger officers, it felt unreal, like watching a battle on a map rather than fighting one. They could hear the thunder of guns in the distance, but saw nothing beyond the phosphorescent waves. At 3:30 in the morning, Admiral Oldendorf gave the order his crews had been waiting for. Prepare to fire when you have the range. The gunnery radars locked onto the Japanese column now less than 10 miles away. Each battleship adjusted its turrets by fractions of degrees. The operators whispered final corrections. Wind, drift, range 10 miles 200 yards. Then came silence. The strait was a black mirror. The Japanese ships advanced unaware that they had already been measured, targeted, and doomed. Within 15 minutes, that silence would be broken by the first radar-directed broadside in history. Radar did more than detect ships. It changed what seeing meant at sea. On the bridges of American battleships, sailors no longer looked outward. They looked downward, into glowing circles of light. The Mark 8 radar sets drew the ocean in lines of green phosphor, each returning pulse a heartbeat from the dark. Operators spoke in code-tight fragments. Bearing 180, Range 12,000 yards. Target group closing. These words replaced eyesight. They became the new language of battle. Admiral Oldendorf trusted this unseen sense completely. His flagship, the USS West Virginia, carried the most advanced radar suite in the fleet. The gunnery computers linked every pulse to mechanical calculators that turned echoes into trajectories. When his ships finally fired, their shells would travel guided not by searchlights or horizon silhouettes, but by mathematics. For the Japanese, that idea was unthinkable. Their doctrine still depended on night optics and flares. Human eyes, sharpened by years of tradition. Vice Admiral Nishimura's crews stood ready at the torpedo tubes, scanning for muzzle flashes that would never come. What they didn't know was that the Americans had already drawn a map of their destruction. On American radar screens, the entire formation, 2 battleships, a cruiser, and 4 destroyers, was outlined with surgical precision. Inside the combat information centers, the tension felt paradoxical. No noise, no smoke, only voices and the faint hum of machines. Each officer waited for the radar trace to cross a predetermined line, the point of no return. When it did, fire control teams relayed coordinates to the gun turrets without ever seeing the enemy. In that instant, naval warfare crossed an invisible frontier. The ancient duel of eyesight and courage had ended. Knowledge itself, pure data, had become the deadliest weapon afloat. For the men aboard the American ships, the night felt unreal. They had trained for years to spot silhouettes, to track gun flashes, to rely on their eyes. Now they were told to aim at nothing. Every ship's bridge was sealed in red light, every gun turret blindfolded by darkness. The radar screens were their only windows to war. Some sailors later said it was like fighting ghosts, firing at echoes, waiting to see if the ocean confirmed the kill. When the first salvos erupted, they tore through the night without warning. 6 American battleships, all veterans of another darker day, fired in unison. West Virginia, California, and Tennessee had once been crippled at Pearl Harbor. Now they were reborn, their guns controlled by radar, their vengeance precise. The ocean lit up with the light of their own resurrection. To the crews, it felt less like revenge and more like closure. The fleet that had been blinded in 1941 had learned to see again in 1944. On the Japanese side, the experience bordered on nightmare. Admiral Nishimura's men could hear the roar of American guns, but saw nothing but darkness. Shells the size of small cars screamed overhead, landing with unearthly accuracy. Some officers thought they were being bombarded from aircraft. Others believed the Americans had invented a new kind of flare. The sea itself appeared to be on fire. Communication broke down as ships vanished from the formation. Their signal lamps shattered, their bridges engulfed in flame. There was no time for tactics, no chance for redemption. Radar had turned the battle into a one-sided execution. But even then, some American sailors hesitated to celebrate. In their after-action reports, a few wrote that it felt strange, destroying ships they never actually saw. The moral weight of unseen warfare had arrived quietly, beneath the sound of triumph. In less than 30 minutes, centuries of naval tradition, gunnery by eyesight, command by instinct, victory by courage, had disappeared. The ocean that night belonged to the machines. At 3:45 in the morning, October 25, 1944, the strait turned from silence to thunder. The West Virginia fired first, 8 16-inch guns in a single heartbeat. Their orange flashes illuminated the black horizon for just a second, then vanished behind shock waves rolling across the water. Within moments, 5 more battleships joined in: California, Tennessee, Maryland, Mississippi, and Pennsylvania. 6 giants aligned in a perfect firing arc, their salvos timed by radar, not eyesight. Every ship's main battery was locked to a target it could not see. The fire control radars tracked the range with mechanical precision, feeding angles into plotting tables that rotated like clockwork. The guns elevated by fractions of degrees. Each shell traveled nearly 20 miles, arcing invisibly through darkness to strike steel that only the radars could confirm existed. When the shells landed, the effect was surgical. The Japanese flagship Yamashiro staggered under direct hits, Her bridge vanished in a column of flame. Mogami was struck moments later, her decks erupting as torpedoes cooked off inside their tubes. On the Japanese radios, confusion turned to panic. No one knew where the Americans were, or how they could be hitting so perfectly. Some reported shore batteries, others, phantom cruisers. What they faced was the first coordinated radar barrage in naval history, a storm guided by invisible eyes. At 4 in the morning, Oldendorf ordered his cruisers to open fire. The narrow strait became a corridor of explosions. The Fuso, already broken by torpedoes, burned from stem to stern, her masts glowing like candles until the sea consumed her. Destroyers on both sides wove through the chaos, launching torpedoes that crossed paths like streaks of lightning. The ocean boiled with flame and fragments. Inside American ships, crews reloaded in rhythm. Each radar operator called out "on target" as blips disappeared from their scopes. They watched the Japanese formation disintegrate dot by dot. It was mechanical, detached, victory by calculation. By 4:20, the strait was silent again, except for the sound of burning oil. In less than 40 minutes, radar-guided gunfire had erased an entire battle line. By 4:20 in the morning, the strait was a furnace. The once proud ships of Vice Admiral Nishimura's Southern Force were now fragments adrift in black water lit by fire. The battleship Yamashiro, her hull torn open by multiple radar-aimed salvos, fought to stay upright. Her remaining guns fired wildly into the dark, shells splashing miles short of the American line. Then one final American broadside found her magazines. A single flash brighter than lightning erupted from her center, and the ship folded inward before sliding beneath the waves. The destroyers Michishio and Yamagumo tried to turn back, but radar picked them up instantly. American cruisers and destroyers fired in perfect succession, each confirming hits by the vanishing echoes on their scopes. Michishio disappeared within seconds. No witnesses, no survivors, only a blank spot where the radar return had been. At 4:30, Admiral Oldendorf ordered, "Cease fire." The radar traces of the Japanese force had vanished. He believed the battle was over. Then a new blip appeared, another column approaching from the south. It was Rear Admiral Shima's reinforcement group, steaming directly into the inferno Nishimura had left behind. Shima's lookout saw only flames and floating wreckage. For a moment he thought the burning ships ahead were the American line. He ordered a torpedo spread, and accidentally fired into the remains of Mogami, one of his own. Moments later, realizing the truth, Shima turned his ships around and fled the strait, leaving behind the dead, the wounded, and the sinking remains of 2 Japanese battleships. As dawn broke over Surigao Strait, the full scene emerged from the smoke. Oil fires burned across miles of water. Broken masts jutted from the surface like grave markers. American sailors stood silently at their stations, watching daylight reveal what radar had already shown hours earlier. It was not a battlefield. It was a cemetery. When Admiral Oldendorf reviewed his charts, he found that every ship in his line had fired entirely by radar data. No searchlights had been used. No visual sighting confirmed. The last battleship duel in history had been fought, and won, without ever seeing the enemy. By sunrise, October 25, 1944, the Surigao Strait was calm again, a mirror of smoke and oil. Patrol boats drifted among the wreckage, pulling half-burned sailors from the sea. They were the last survivors of a fleet that no longer existed. Of the 7 Japanese ships that entered the strait, 6 were sunk. More than 4,000 men were lost in less than an hour. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura went down with his flagship Yamashiro, his body never found. The Americans suffered only minor damage. Not a single capital ship was lost. Their losses, 39 killed, 1 destroyer damaged, were almost microscopic by the standards of naval warfare. Yet no one on the American side celebrated loudly. What they had witnessed did not feel like victory. It felt like extinction. They had seen the final breath of the battleship era. For centuries, naval power meant line-of-battle engagements, the thunder of guns and the skill of sighting. Surigao Strait ended that tradition forever. The last crossing of the T in history had been executed not by sailors staring across the horizon, but by men watching radar scopes in sealed rooms. The next great battles of the Pacific would not belong to ships like West Virginia or Yamashiro, but to aircraft and submarines, to machines that could see without light and strike without warning. That morning, as Oldendorf's fleet steamed north to rejoin the fight off Leyte, few realized they had just fought the last battleship duel the world would ever see. History would remember it as a victory. The sea as a farewell. The destruction at Surigao Strait was only one piece of a much larger storm. As Oldendorf's guns fell silent, other battles raged across hundreds of miles. Off Samar, Cape Engano, and Sibuyan Sea. Together they formed the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval confrontation in human history. 4 Japanese task forces had sailed to destroy the American invasion fleet. By the end of October 25th, all 4 were shattered. At Surigao, radar had decided the night. At Samar, courage had decided the day. American escort carriers and destroyers, vastly outgunned, fought off Kurita's central force in what became one of the most heroic defenses of the war. By the time the sun set, Japan's surface navy had ceased to function as a coherent weapon. The once mighty battleships of the Imperial Navy had either been sunk, crippled, or confined to harbor without fuel. Never again would Japan launch a fleet engagement on the open sea. In Tokyo, the reports were unbelievable. Admirals refused to accept that centuries of seamanship and doctrine had been undone by an invisible beam of radio energy. But the truth was undeniable. Surigao Strait proved that technology had eclipsed tradition. Speed, optics, and courage no longer guaranteed survival. Detection did. Whoever could see first now ruled the ocean. For the United States, the battle marked both vindication and transition. Radar-directed gunnery had worked flawlessly, but even as the victors wrote their reports, the carriers had already replaced the big guns as the core of naval power. The Pacific belonged to machines now. Machines that could see, think, and kill beyond the horizon. Surigao Strait was not just the last battle of its kind. It was the first battle of the future. When the smoke cleared over Surigao Strait, dawn revealed more than wreckage. It showed the end of an era. The ships that had once ruled empires had fired their last true salvos. From then on, the ocean would belong to aircraft, to radar, and to silence. For the men who fought there, the memory was not of victory but of transformation. The night the sea itself seemed to open its eyes. From that moment, darkness no longer protected the brave, and courage alone could not command a fleet. Surigao Strait was the last time battleships ruled the horizon, and the first time the future fired back.